This is Brad Johnson. You're listening to the Break It Down show.
Yes, indeed. Look, I love these spy versus spy episodes because you and I have both done the job in various forms, and you know how different our world can be. But our job involved around gathering information to help our country, whether it was like me, tactical level for a commander who may be a 22-year-old kid, or you, servicing, foreign policy at the highest level. There's a lot of different ways to approach these problems. And I guess my first question, Brad, is in these political times where things are super divided and we have problems even just getting a legitimate investigation or doing what legally we're required to do when there's a compromise, can we ever get the politics out of intelligence?
Well, of course, that's the purpose of Americans for Intelligence Reform, and why I founded the organization a few years ago, is to try and start to work on that. Truthfully, it's not certainly one of those things that can be fixed with who is there. And so we're going to have a kind of a change of philosophy and how government is looked at. And that's something that's very difficult to overcome. We had in President Trump somebody who was willing to take a look at all of those sorts of issues from that way. He, unfortunately, a great president, but unfortunately was kind of ill prepared to understand how to make government do what he wants. That was just one of the things that he didn't really have the background for. And the people he surrounded himself with were either people that weren't working towards those same goals or who were just like him and didn't know. So I would have to say, under current circumstances, I mean, ultimately the answer to your question is no. Politics cannot be taken out of the intelligence anytime soon, and certainly not under the Biden administration, where that's a big net plus from their perspective. So it's a real problem.
I want to and I don't want to make this like about Donald Trump and Joe Biden, but this is sort of where we're at right now. One of the problems with Donald Trump, no matter how effective or ineffective he was, is just his presence drove, 40% of the nation crazy. And to the negative, to the detrimental. So even if he was going to get things right, let's say half of the time, because being president is hard. That's not a knock on him. It's an impossible job. Half of the nation is still going to think he gets it wrong. So he gets to be right like 25% of the time and doesn't ever get credit. And this is for Joe Biden as well, to get better. I mean, every president has gotten better from day one to day, whatever they had left. If you're at 25% approval capacity, because you are going to make mistakes, again, is it even possible, or should we even take the politics out? Or I don't know. How do we deal with this problem where someone who even tries doesn't know enough to know enough, but people who know enough are polluted because they're part of the problem?
Yeah, I mean, there are a long list of issues there that you've laid out with that. I mean, first of all, President Trump, while he had his weaknesses, and you're absolutely correct pointing out that every president comes in with strengths and weaknesses, and there's no real way to prepare to be president. I mean, it's a one-time type of job that there's not a lot of equivalency to. They do kind of say that, well, being a governor of a state is kind of an executive position with some parallels, which I'm sure there are parallels, but still, it doesn't really necessarily prepare you to be president. But so Trump, one of his great weaknesses was, I would say, not really understanding bureaucracy in government, which, in the scheme of things as a person, that's probably a plus. Having come out of the swamp, I don't count that as any great virtue, understanding bureaucracy and the nonsense that goes on there. The way he handled the economy and the way he handled foreign relations, and of course that's my background, having been overseas most of my adult life and watched how he handled the economy. I mean, while he was hated by 40% of the country, you have to look at the job, his performance on what he did there, and he's probably one of the great presidents of United States history. I mean, he did some great things in the economy. So while his grade should be A or A plus, and the argument should be between those two things, certainly on those two areas, which are near and dear to my heart, he was roundly criticized by the press and Democratic Party, but it's irrational. Those things were irrational. If you looked at what he actually did and what he accomplished and how it impacted the United States of America and we the people, then he's at AA plus for certainly those two things. Now, you have a group of the, like, I'll continue to use your number of this 40% of the population that still hate him no matter what. Well, is that a criticism of President Trump, or is that a criticism of the position of president, or is that a criticism of those 40% of the people? And I would argue to you that that's those 40% of the people that are absolutely fruitcake over this stuff, don't care about reality, don't care about the truth, don't care about what's good for the United States of America. They don't even care what's good for them. And the thing that the lowest unemployment rate to ever exist for most of the minorities in the United States, Hispanics, blacks, Asians, things like that, those are completely glossed over. Well, screw those guys. I mean, that, like I said, that's irrational. So why should any of us jump into this mass hysteria and all of that? So that point that you make there of the 40% is a criticism of those 40%. And they need to be rational and look at this. And Joe Biden, the problem with Joe is, I mean, even his vice president criticized him and pointed out in the primary that he's senile. And, everybody just looks at this stuff he says that's like, no vaccination existed before he became president for COVID, and, the wrong date, what office he's running for. I mean, and he did make the comment that he's put together the largest team to commit fraud in election history and stuff like that. I mean, that, okay, that's Joe. Joe says stupid stuff, he does, but the problem is much deeper than that. And, you have to deal with the reality of the situation, because you've got a guy in the Oval Office, who may not understand what that button in front of him does when he pushes it. There's stories about him. Jill, his wife, said some comment about every morning he wakes up and says to her, "Where are we now?" And yeah, haha, it's a joke, we're at the White House, but it's also, if he's seriously getting up in the morning and saying, "Where am I?" There's some problems there. And all of that, we need to look at this and deal with all of this stuff rationally, and we don't. And the intelligence community, kind of moving on to the last segment of what you mentioned, that kind of, lays the groundwork for the problem that you see in the intelligence community, because what they do now is, because they're political, the information they obtain goes through a prism, and it's split out, and only the acceptable information is passed forward. So the problem with that is it's the same thing in the court system, where you leave out exculpatory evidence, meaning you leave out evidence that proves the guy's innocent. Well, it's the same thing in intelligence. You go through this filter of deciding which information to move forward and which information to hold back. And what you do with that, because you're politically motivated in the way you filter it, that means what you're doing in essence is lying to decision makers, because it's not only a lie of commission, meaning you say something that's blatantly false. There's also a lie of omission, meaning you don't tell the full truth. Both of those are lies. And what we have here now is the intelligence community as a whole lying to decision makers, lying to our policymakers, the president and the Congress, and they do it in such a way that they're not able necessarily in the government sector to make the right decisions. So these politically motivated things are extraordinarily damaging to national security, and I would argue that there's cases of these sorts of decision-making processes already having gotten people killed. And certainly I would say and the ambassador in Benghazi is a beautiful example of that, where he knew he needed more security and had been begging and begging for more security, and was turned down because it wasn't politically expedient. What they wanted was to show this friendly hand reaching out to the inhabitants in that particular Muslim country, and they didn't want to appear to be unfriendly, didn't want to build walls and all of that. And what happened, and this is something nobody likes to talk about, what happened was just one day, whenever they got around to it, they stormed the embassy, killed everybody in there, including the ambassador, stripped him naked, stuck a pole up his behind, and they paraded him around the city for hours naked on that pole as a result. Now, that is just abject stupidity. People should have gone to jail, should have been investigated, and that was, of course, during the Obama days with Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State. And not only, and just look at how that was handled. Like I said, essentially it was a cover-up. And Hillary Clinton said, famously, what difference does it make now why they did it? Well, let me answer that. Because one of the reasons it makes a difference why is because in all of these things, and I think, Pete, you'll support me on this a lot, is you always want after action reports. You want lessons learned. Why did this horrible thing take place? And you need to do a full study on each of these and go back and look at every step along the way so that you see every mistake that was made that led to this fiasco and the murder, not just of a man, but of a U.S. ambassador of the United States of America who represents our country overseas, in this case in Benghazi. And that's why you go back and do these, so that the same thing doesn't happen again. And that's why these things are so important. And I don't know. I wish we would just have a greater respect for what's important in national security and saving lives and those sorts of things. We just simply do not anymore.
Yeah, it's always, it's hard for me when I talk to you because I get so impassioned about this thing. I think about what it means, like if I worked for you and I was out in the field collecting things, there's a couple things. Let me go back in time. That prism has several different lenses that are attached to it sometimes. Mm-hmm. When I write a report, I'm thinking about someone 4 or 5 echelons above me and what they're going to extract out. And because I've seen it, you'll see your sentence in there verbatim, and you're like, that's my sentence, completely out of context, and actually the opposite of what that report said. But it didn't suit that analyst's picture in their mind, So here's some ground truth comes, and they change it. So even if it's not political, you have this problem of, we want to report that schools are working, and I might say, while there were 40 girls at the school on, the 14th when we all went there, I went back on the 15th and there were no kids in school. As a matter of fact, that location was being used as a business or whatever it is, right? But that's not what's reported up. What gets stripped out is all of the next day stuff and the performance of that school. So there's that aspect of intel. And then as we're trying to make these strategic and theoretic decisions and adjustments, we're not able to accurately do that. Then you bring in my faith in the structures, the big structures of the government, FBI, CIA, is completely destroyed. I know that there are good people on the ground, but the folks up top are far too interested in other things from my point of view. And that it doesn't go back to this, but this is the main moment. We've talked about this in the past. The fact that Secretary Clinton admits to having TS SCI on her server and that it's her fault, and nothing happens. She admits to it, and then there's also no investigation into what happened with all this information. It's like it didn't exist, no big deal. And then it turns into whataboutism. That's a significant problem, and you compromise a guy like me. We compromise an office like you would run in a foreign country because who knows what's on that. I mean, anything that's on there is compromised, right?
Absolutely, and and that particular case is one I find just so egregious, and it's one of those things. It's easier to talk about the FBI, so I tend to pick on them and don't mean to in particular. I mean, the CIA and NSA and DOD and State Department, many of those are much worse. It's just that the FBI is more of an open book, so it's easier to do some of these things, but. Plus, I got to be really careful about what I say about the CIA. Just not to. I don't want to reveal anything that's classified. I have to follow certain guidelines in how I handle that. But for the FBI, what you brought up, for the example, the Hillary Clinton, classified documents, that was on. Copies of a lot of that stuff were on the Anthony Weiner laptop, and the Anthony Weiner laptop was picked up in that child sex scandal part of what Anthony Weiner was up to in his spare time. But James Comey, then FBI director, made that famous speech in July of 2015, I believe it was, where he said, well, she was just sloppy, but, no prosecutor would go after this. But in that same speech, he admitted that there were, 12 or 15 lines of communications, so that when you respond to something, that all is in one line of all the different responses. And in these 12 or 15 lines of responses, there were a couple of hundred classified documents. So in each one of those, right? So you kind of add those up, and so you got, okay, well, maybe 2,000 or 3,000 classified documents in there, which is a whole shit pot in my perspective, from my perspective, that are on some guy's laptop at his house, Anthony Weiner. Now, there's no ifs, ands, or buts. There's no questions there. The FBI who took the computer initially, the investigator who was out in Seattle, Washington, found those. They were confirmed to be on there by the director of the FBI. And so we know that there were thousands of classified documents on this. 2 or 3, don't know how many, but 2,000 or 3,000 roughly classified documents on there. And nothing was done, as you say. And that the FBI IG did an inspection based on that. They went to the guy who was initially found it, the guy who was exploiting the computer, who did not have a clearance, and so he was hesitant to do much with this stuff. And he said that James Comey, and this is the FBI IG inspection. This isn't my interpretation of anything. This is what's stated in the IG inspection. That guy said that James Comey misled the American people by a factor of approximately 10 as to how many classified documents were on there. So we go from maybe 2,000 or 3,000 to maybe 20 or 30,000 classified documents on that computer. General Petraeus was cashiered, his career destroyed over one classified document that he had in his desk at home, locked in his desk, which is not proper storage.
Right.
And he showed it to his girlfriend/lover, who had a clearance, by the way, and he showed her this classified document and then put it back and locked it in the drawer. Okay, Petraeus, dumbass mistake. Okay, cashiered over it. He paid the price for it. And in this computer that Anthony Weiner had, that his personal computer, he had 20 or 30 classified 1,000 documents on there. And one more aspect of it, there was a second IG inspection done. This computer was taken to Quantico, where the FBI has its forensics lab. It's being stored there according to the second IG report, FBI IG report. And in that second FBI IG report, again, not me saying any of this, this is right out of the report, there was a second memory in that computer that had an equal amount of information, which they did not open and look at. And so that then doubles what's on that computer. So now we don't know if there was any overlap or anything between those. Maybe some of these were the same documents, maybe they were different. But that then gives the potential or the possibility of no longer 20 or 30,000 classified documents, but maybe 40 to 60,000 classified. Just averaging it out, let's call it maybe as many as 50,000 classified documents on it, and nobody cares. Again, I go back. That is a lot of stuff, and some portion of that was TSSCI, which is top secret, the highest stuff that's in there, sources and methods and all of that. Some of that stuff was CIA, some of it was State Department, some of it was NSA. Nobody ever looked to see, and all of that information would have immediately been hacked. It would be child's play for people like Russia and China to have gotten all of that information. So here we're in a situation where Russia and China had all that, have exploited it for years. We've had a number of CIA assets through these periods of time be wrapped up and executed by their governments for reporting to the CIA, including most specifically in China. And we don't know if it came from that. It could have been from this stuff. Now, probably not, or maybe some portions were, some weren't. Maybe, and intelligence doesn't work necessarily in a linear way. What's been reported and leaked on that is that these ones in China, for example, were caught by using a crappy communication system that didn't stand up to the scrutiny. But how did they find that communication system? Maybe they learned about it from these documents, and they exploited that information, tracked it back to the communication system, which then tracked them back to these guys, of which I believe they took out and shot by firing squad 20 some odd people. And a couple of other went to prison. I'm sure they're all dead by now, but and these were they were taken out of their desk, walked out the front door and shot right outside the front door, so all of their coworkers would see the dead bodies and understand the risks that were entailed in this. So you look at this sort of stuff, and there's thing after thing after thing just like this, and I would argue the FISA court thing too. We know 100% for a fact, confirmed by the court systems and what we've gone through, that there was fraud and perjury in those FISA requests to a FISA court judge in order for the FBI to surveil initially candidate Trump and then later President Trump. And so we know that was taking place, but what's going on with that? Where is the investigation? Supposedly John Durham is doing that, but outgoing AG Barr, Attorney General Barr, said, oh, this is just a very small thing. Don't be expecting much out of this investigation. So once again, if you're in a position of power, if you're in that group of elites, if you're a political elite, you don't have to care what the laws are. You can do anything. You can do anything, including negligence, perhaps, that got the U.S. ambassador killed. You can take classified documents home and put them on your laptop, and who knows how many people got killed out of that. What sort of secrets were betrayed out of that are important to U.S. national security? Nobody knows, because we never looked. You're just thing after thing, including dead people, and nobody cares. Nobody cares. I mean, what does it take to get to the point where these elites are going to be investigated and pay the price for their crimes? I mean, all the stuff I've laid out, like I said, none of it is my opinion. These are observable facts that we know are true, and yet nothing is being done. If the FBI were not corrupt, politically corrupt, and if the DOJ were not politically corrupt, somebody would have gone to jail for those things. Now, I'm not saying, necessarily it's Hillary Clinton, but Anthony Weiner we know is guilty because he had thousands of classified documents on his computer at home. That's every one of those is individually illegal. Now, any law enforcement of any consequence, and most assuredly including the FBI, all day long will go to a guy like that and say, okay, here we have about 10,000 years worth of crime for you to go to jail for. Do you want to go to jail for it? Or would you like to tell us how you got those on your computer? Somebody's going to jail for this. Is it going to be you? Or you want to tell us, who's the next person up the totem pole? And, on certainly his wife, because he didn't have direct access to it. So it had to come through Huma, his wife. Yeah. So then they go to Huma and say, Huma, are you going to jail for 5 consecutive life sentences? Or are you going to tell us where you got these? Right. And, she either sings like a little birdie, or she and her ex-husband go to jail forever. This is something law enforcement could do all day long. And yet that computer sits right now in Quantico because of a corrupt DOJ and a corrupt FBI at the leadership levels. Now, rank and file, there's good people all over the FBI and DOJ, I'm sure. But at the leadership level, it's a cesspool.
And if you are 100% wrong on all of that assessment, the thing is when you have Bill Clinton in the Attorney General's plane on the day his wife's going through her subject interview, which is exactly what that was. You can't do that and expect us to take you seriously. Like we have information you haven't even followed up on. So as a ground collector, as someone that I would look, if I was an opposing force, China, Ghana, whatever country it is, I'm going to say, let's go spend a couple $1 million and see who else we can get. We see that, and again, it happens to be Democrats in these examples, but this is across the board. Dianne Feinstein has a spy as her chief of staff. Oh my God, no big deal. Okay, I mean, how do you not? I would lose my clearance. I would lose my clearance in a second if I had employed for decades a Chinese spy. So you see all these holes that encourages compromise, and then, like you said, if we're not even going to follow up, if we're going to act like we don't care, then the Americans don't care about this stuff, and we are going to compromise other things. So it's not just dead bodies. I'm fascinated by, first off, what was the number? I think it was every 20 hours on average, there is a counterintelligence case opened against China by the United States. So every day. And every time they ship some kind of piece of electrical equipment for our electrical grid, it gets impounded, and the DOE runs through it trying to figure out how it's compromised, because we already know that it is. And they can't keep up with that work. There are all these holes that we like you said, we act like we don't care. Should we care? I don't know. We passed the point. If we're past the point of politics getting out of this, Brad, what do we do about this? This is a mess. We're completely compromised.
They're just, the Chinese are like a leech, on our backs, sucking the lifeblood out of us. There's just no question. And now we've seen some of the Biden picks. Forgive me for going back into Biden. I know you don't want to make it so political, but some of these people, like the UN ambassador, was somebody who was basically on the payroll of the Chinese. I mean, was part of a foundation, a nonprofit, of which with millions of dollars were funneled into it, openly by the Chinese. They were supporting this effort. So in essence, you have somebody on the payroll of the Chinese moving over to a UN ambassador. I mean, you would have to look in a rational world. You would look at that and say, well, even if this was a decent person, the optics on that are so crappy, we can't have that person. And she should never have been, I don't know if that approval's gone through yet or not. I don't remember where it stands, but it's something that everybody should vote against. It should be, almost unanimous against her, both Democrats and Republicans. But again, it's in one of these things where politics have taken over everything and are kind of starving the tree off of any sun and water. Let me go back to one thing you mentioned, though, too, because you raised Dianne Feinstein. And again, it's one of those corruption elements that we see, particularly political corruption out of the FBI. Dianne Feinstein, it was discovered by the FBI that she had a spy for the Chinese on her staff for 20 years out in California, chief of staff at her office back at her home state. And they went to her and said, hey, you've got a spy at working for you. So she fires him and he goes back to China. Congressman Swalwell, who's sleeping with a Chinese spy, who's also funneling money, according to the FBI, funneling money into his campaign, he gets told, hey, you're sleeping with a spy who's the one also putting money in your campaign. And, so he goes and tells her, apparently, because the next day she left the country and was back in China. So compare that to how President Trump was, treated. And this, by the way, this is regulation. This is what you're supposed to do. Right. They suspect some low-level schmuck of on his staff who wasn't even a paid person. He was a volunteer, of being a Russian spy. And so what do they do to him? They lie and cheat and steal on a FISA warrant to surveil him and didn't. And one final point on Swalwell and Dianne Feinstein, senator from California and congressman from California and Swalwell, which interesting coincidence, by the way. I don't like coincidences. And so she's got this guy on her staff for 20 years. Well, let me start with Swalwell. One of the things that the FBI pointed out that was a problem with this lady that he was sleeping with was that she had been recommending people for him to put, on his staff in his office. And they apparently had hired somebody like that. Now, I don't know if it was like an unpaid intern or a staff position, that sort of thing. But let me just say, having been a human intelligence guy for, basically my adult life, that's just like absolute pablum, basic 101 sort of thing that you would do. I have handled cases where I'm doing similar things with similar objectives, and I guarantee anybody, it is child's play, absolutely guaranteed. Chinese intelligence, very first thing they thought of was use these people to get people in the pipeline into Swalwell's office. And most people have never worked on the Hill and don't see how it works, which God bless if you've never had to go through that nonsense. But the way that works is a lot like musical chairs. These staffers move around to different staffs, and the positions they're in are not well paid. So they're always looking for a little bit better job on somebody else's staff or somewhere else. So once you're in there and once you're working, it's like this gateway to the rest of the Hill. So it's why it's an absolute no-brainer for an intelligence service working against us when they have a channel like this to put somebody in there. Now, going back to Dianne Feinstein, this guy was her chief of staff for 20 years. What does that mean? She has to campaign out in California every 6 years, and that means she needs donors and money and all of this. Does anyone think that the Chinese did not take advantage of that to funnel campaign funds into her? They did. What comes with that? What comes with that is the ability to say, by the way, I gave you $10,000 for your campaign. My nephew of my cousin needs a job in Washington, D.C. He wants to go out there as an intern. It can be unpaid. It can be one of your low-level staff. It can be this or that. Yeah. 20 years. How many people were put in that pipeline to go out and work on the Hill? And where did they end up? What offices are they working at now? And again, nobody, where the hell is the FBI on that? How many people were run through there? How many Chinese spies are working on the Hill right now that were put into that pipeline and put into those positions by Dianne Feinstein's staff or by Swalwell's staff? How many? And the answer is nobody knows. Were there attempts to do so? Yes. Where did they end up? We don't know. Because where's the FBI? We don't know. They don't investigate that stuff because it's a Democrat. If it were a Republican, well, they'd go to FISA and they'd get a warrant and they would surveil them and go look at all that stuff. So it's just this runaway political corruption that we have here. You know, how much damage can be done by Chinese spies who are staffers on the Hill? And I'm telling you right now, it's devastating, absolutely devastating. They would have the inside track on policy and budget, and depending on which staff they were on, if they were on any sort of intelligence oversight, they would have tons of information. It's very hard to even calculate how much damage could be done, and probably was done through just those two cases. And yet nobody goes and looks at it. And like we talked about earlier, you have to go back and do those damage assessments, and you have to go back and look at how did all this happen to us, and make sure you close those gates so it doesn't happen again. And nobody's doing it. Nobody's talking about it outside of myself. I mean, it is kind of the reason for having Americans for Intelligence Reform. But, outside of that, where's mainstream media? Fox News, they don't talk about stuff like this because it's a stick in the eye of politicians, and they don't want to do that because those guys have too much power. And the leadership, they all look at it. Dianne Feinstein, Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi for Swalwell was saying, I don't have a problem with Swalwell. He's a good guy. That's just that little thing happened, but so what? Didn't matter. Nothing important there. Nothing to see there. No, And how do you know there's nothing to see there? Because the investigation was never done.
And even when we do investigations, nothing ever comes of it. Again, how long do we investigate all of these stupid things? Russiagate, the emails, all these things, and then nothing comes of the investigation. I mean, we investigated over and over again the whole Benghazi thing. And look, I've worked in dangerous places. There's never enough security. Someone's always asking for more. So maybe it's just a shitty set of circumstances, which is instantly covered up with a lie. Okay, maybe that happens. But we never, ever get to the point where we're like, how do we improve this? How do we prevent this? If you have to hire former SEALs and infantry guys to protect the consulate, because you can't protect these things, and these guys have fully automatic weapons and are getting into gunfights like that, we've got a problem. We've got a bigger problem to deal with. I want to also make the point, if we flip the camera around, and I don't want to make you say anything you don't need to say for the CIA, but if I come to you as my boss and I say, I have got a member of parliament, and I've got my source hired on there, they're going to be chief of staff, and these staffers tend to hop around all the parliament offices, is that valuable to you? You're going to lose your mind and be like, yes, we're going to get you a team. We're going to run this. We're going to expand it. And we're going to crab out into all of these things. And we're not going to be pushy. We're going to be so invisible and quiet. No one's ever going to know what happens. And you say China and Russia, of course, but everybody collects on everybody. Everybody does. And then one of the things for the audience, so like we have an agreement with certain countries that we're partnered with. It's not a big secret. Everybody knows that. China does the same thing. And so if it's not China getting in, it's somebody else getting in and working with China to share this information. It absolutely is a competitive contest, and they're trying to get information, and people die. Billions and billions of dollars are stolen in terms of, IP and other things. Another thing that China does really well is they get someone into a university where they start doing research for something that will be classified one day. But right now it's so early in the process. So you have a spy who's ahead of the classification, which is another dream spot. So when you talk about these things, Brad, these are big, complicated, hard problems. We're not even talking about how to improve the quality of our agents on the ground who collect. We can't even protect our own stuff, let alone effectively go out. I mean, maybe we're better at collecting other people's things, but gosh, who even cares if our house is leaking so much, we're not in any way protected. And it's not just Democrats. We only have seen these Republican or these Democrat examples. If there's two, there's 20, And they're everywhere.
That's right. And I would say this is one of the things that's just come up recently. I mean, one of my many criticisms of Dianne Feinstein, a person for whom I have no respect whatsoever, she's somebody through her family. I looked at every year they have to do financial disclosures, and in her financial disclosure, I've forgotten now precisely, but I think she's worth roughly $600 or $700 million. Getting close to $1 billion of wealth between her and her husband. Most of that made by the husband, roughly half of which was made by doing business with China. And now that by itself, Dianne Feinstein, in her defense, what she says on that is that she has a firewall between what she does and what her husband does. Okay. Yeah, all right, fine. Okay, that's never been investigated. So, I would want to take a very long, serious look at that personally, but that's fine. But that also exists on the Republican side. This is something that just came out in this little spat between Mitch McConnell, the GOP leader of the Senate, and Republican leader of the Senate, and his wife, who's also of Chinese descent. And they jointly have also made something along the lines of, say, 200 million, not nearly as much as Dianne Feinstein, but a large chunk of which, perhaps again, half of that money came out of doing business with China. So, I mean, that by itself, to me, should be a very important factor in things that get looked at. And to me, that should be nonpartisan. However, it is not. It is not looked at by anybody. It's not considered a concern by anybody. But if you look at the voting record of those two particular individuals, how they vote in relation to China, they're some of the softest voters on those issues. Now, is there a linkage between making $100 million or more by doing business with China and voting very gently on China issues? I would argue that that is something that should be examined and looked at. And I find it very suspicious. If Mitch McConnell were somebody and Dianne Feinstein were people that were just like hammering China on a daily basis, well, for one thing, I doubt they'd be making the hundreds of millions of dollars. But if they were hammering China on a daily basis, I'd be a little less suspicious. But, sometimes if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck and has feathers like a duck, maybe it's a duck. Maybe we should look at it and see if indeed that is a duck. But none of that stuff is done. And why? It's because they're the political elites. It's just the elite leadership at the FBI and DOJ and the politicians and the media. That's all one group of people. And they view themselves as all one group of people. And if you look at how these business deals are done, these real estate deals, how does Chuck Schumer become a multimillionaire? Real estate deals, all of them had that. And there's cases of where people probably won't remember now, but Charles Rangel was a very senior guy, out in New York, I believe, that very senior guy in the Democratic Party and had a lot of chairmanships and stuff like that. Very powerful guy. And, he was doing all these dirty deals in real estate and had this property that he hadn't declared on his taxes that was income producing. And he got caught laying by the pool in his swimsuit at this condo that he owned, illegally by IRS standards, and was destroyed out of that stuff. But that's just one guy, and like you say, if there's one, there's 20. And in this particular case, I would say we're pretty safely in the 10 or 15 range here. So, that probably means that times 20. I mean, there are hundreds of these guys. And it's just, it's this breakdown of our system. And part of the problem I have with all of this stuff and not knowing precisely what to do is, and I use FISA as an example. The FISA laws were well written. They were well thought through. I've worked in those issues. I'm very familiar with how it's used when it's used properly. And there's nothing really wrong with the FISA laws. What's wrong with that is who was there enforcing it. And you had guys with, James Comey and James Clapper and Peter Strzok and people like that were there that were signing these FISA warrant applications to a FISA judge who were lying. And they were misrepresenting the facts. And John Brennan, the former CIA director, all those guys were involved in all this. If half of those guys had been honest people who were doing their job and protecting the United States of America, they wouldn't have been able to get away with it. But they were all in that same group of people. So the problem isn't the laws. The problem is the people who were there, which, by the way, going back to President Trump, as I say, one of his weaknesses, I would argue, in coming into the presidency was that's something he did not understand. He talked about draining the swamp, but draining the swamp to him was reducing regulation and red tape, which he did do very effectively. But what he didn't understand, I believe, at least initially, now I'm sure he does, but what he didn't understand was that those guys are the swamp. And in order to drain the swamp, you have to get rid of those guys. Now, I would go about it if I were president, which, trust me, I have no interest in that job. But if I were president, one of the things I would look at is, for example, the FBI, how it's structured. Now, the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover long wanted, after World War II, when the CIA was going to be established, J. Edgar Hoover fought like a mad dog to get that under him in the FBI. One of the main reasons, there were other reasons, but one of the main reasons it was not was because it was too much power in one person's hands to be director of foreign intelligence all around the world and the lead federal law enforcement agency in the United States of America. That was too much power, which, by the way, that was how the KGB was organized in the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union fell apart, what did they do? They broke that in half, much like the US did, because too much power in too few hands, even for them. And so we created this FBI, but now what do we have? Now the FBI is actually split roughly 2/3 and 1/3. 2/3 is the same criminal division that everybody, is used to seeing, that enforces law and all sorts of ways, all sorts of different crimes. And you have the 1/3 that is a full-blown intelligence agency. It's basically a mini CIA. And what do we have? What was Peter Strzok? Peter Strzok was from that. He was from the CI division of the FBI, which is the mini CIA within the FBI. And this is a perfect example of why too much power in too few hands creates political corruption. Because eventually, even if we started out and put a good guy in there, eventually somebody will follow along that is weak as a person, his morality, his self image, all of these different things are so weak that he will fall into the political corruption. And that was what we had happen with Peter Strzok. And in some ways, that's not his fault. In some ways, it's the fault of the system that we allowed to be created under the FBI. So one of the things that absolutely has to be fixed, and this is something that will need to be done, and that is you're going to have to break those two things out. That CI division of the FBI has to be split out of the FBI and become either its own agency or maybe kind of combine some other things in with it, but as a separate agency. And the FBI criminal division needs to be exactly what it is and just keep going exactly as it does. That needs to remain, where it is, what it is, as it is. But that CI division, the mini CIA that exists within the FBI, has got to be split off. It just has to be, because again, too much power in too few hands. And I would even argue that some of that needs to be looked at DOD, because DOD now has DIA, a lot of intelligence stuff going on. Does that really belong in the hands of the military? Again, they're the guys with all the guns. Having all the guns and the serious weaponry, that's a lot of power. So do you want to add to that power, or are you putting too much power in too few hands? I would argue one of the reasons that OSS at the end of World War II was split off and put into its own CIA agency was for exactly that. They did not want all that power sitting in the hands of just the military. And yet now the military has its own, I wouldn't even call it a mini CIA. I would say it's like a pretty much full-blown CIA. And they also have their own intelligence units within the Marine Corps, Navy, Army, and they all have their own intelligence functions as well. Now, some of that is straight up military order of battle, belongs there sort of stuff, but some of it is not. And this is in large part a major cause of this corruption that we have now, because of power concentrated in too few of hands. One of the reasons traditionally the CIA was not a cabinet position, most people don't know that, it was not a cabinet position because cabinet positions decide policy. CIA, for example, this was, and I love Reagan as a president. I think he's, again, one of the great presidents that we've had in certainly modern history, but in all of history, he was a great president. accomplished great things, including the fall of the Berlin Wall. But one of his mistakes was the guy that was the head of his campaign, who, by the way, his campaign headquarters was located very near me from when he won his first election. And that man was a close friend of his that had come out of OSS. And so he put him in as director of the CIA and made it a cabinet position based on that friendship and trust that he had for that man. The problem is, like I said, you put in a good guy, but after that good guy has a brain tumor and dies, somebody else gets in there and it remains a cabinet position. So now what do we have? We now have a CIA that's fully political. The director of the CIA is a cabinet position, goes to cabinet meetings, decides policy. That's wrong, because what you want is intelligence to have not a damn thing to do with policy. You want them to go get the information, give it to policymakers and say, screw you, do with it what you want. This is the truth. So, don't care what you think of it. Go do what you do. And that's what you have to have. And that's just been eroded at every level. Again, I know I'm going on this, I'll shut up in a second, but one last point on this is under the Obama years, under then CIA Director John Brennan, all of those things were dissolved, even in-house. And you have the Directorate of Operations, which is where I spent my career, which is the spy business, espionage, covert action, all of those things. That was the Directorate of Operations. That was dissolved, and now it's one size fits all. Now, there are many, many, many problems with that. I would argue to you that it's exceptionally stupid to have done that, and I'm stunned that this has remained in place this long. But one of the many problems out of that really is important is now you have analysts also involved in collection.
Uh-oh.
What works well is that there's a separation there, which is how it was originally run for like 5 decades. But what happened when that was all done away with and eroded, you had operations that went out, recruited people, found the information, wrote it up and sent it in. Don't care what you do with it. Here's the truth. Damn the torpedoes. And the analysts get it, and they take all analytical information from everywhere, including open source, OSINT, SIGINT, signals intelligence, whatever they get, the human sources, they put it together, they put a product up. Again, they don't have anything to do with policy, and they send that forward. But now what we have is even down at the level of the analysts, they're involved in the collection process. And what happens? We in the business, we call it falling in love with your source. Yep. Because you're the guy that collects it. You get that information from that source, and you trust him and like him. You go, well, this is what's right. And all that other information out there that's contradictory, I'm not going to listen to any of that because my guy told me this. And that is one of the problems. And our intelligence system, just top to bottom, bottom to top, sideways, it's just been destroyed by these guys. And this is just, again, one of the elements of it. You have to have operations be separate. They go collect the information. You have to have the analysts be separate and have their product that they do, and it not be involved in policy. Because what happens is you become like the Department of State. What happened to them after World War II, they became bureaucratized, but to them, and this is something they're widely criticized over this, it comes up every few years. I'm definitely not the first person to point this out. But because they create policy becomes the objective. To fulfill the policy, not to fix the problem. I can give many examples of this, but I'll just use one that's recent history out of Yugoslavia, and they created Bosnia. So they needed to have a peace solution that respected all parties. So that was the policy. So they set about to do the policy, and the policy became the objective, which they succeeded. They were able to force this down everybody's throats by having international forces in Bosnia and these countries nearby to enforce this. And so it was shoved down everybody's throats. So what is Bosnia? Bosnia is a town of Sarajevo that was largely Muslim. Those were the Muslims, a long historical thing, I won't get into it, but it was a little byproduct of the Ottoman Empire collapsing that got left behind. That was just a town with some Muslims in it. And around it was Croatia and Serbia. So in order to make that policy work, they shaved off a chunk of Croatia, shaved off a chunk of Serbia and boom, put it into this coalition country that's now Bosnia. So what did that actually accomplish? Now, the violence in there is well established. We all know everybody killed everybody. There were no innocent people involved in this. And there are a lot of movies and documentaries, and there's absolute proof that everybody killed everybody. You know, Muslims were guilty, Croats were guilty, Serbs were guilty. They were all guilty.
They even
so what did this policy accomplish? This peace policy that they decided was this greatest thing, what it did was made absolutely 100% sure that when all of those troops finally leave, the fighting picks back up again. That's what they did. That's what that policy accomplished. It made sure that there'll be another war. So this is just a perfect example of that, where if you're making policy and policy becomes the objective, not creating a lasting peace, then that's how you get led astray. And that, like I say, I'm not the first to point this out about State Department, but it's why State Department is so useless and broken and worthless as an organization. And again, somebody has to come in and just whip this into shape and create something that's useful again. Like before World War II, State Department was one of the greatest organizations on earth, and it just went away into the night after World War II. So it's destroyed. So I've gone on too long. I'll shut up for a bit.
No, come on. That was awesome. That was awesome. There are so many things I want to say to that. One, I totally agree with you. The State Department, one, should be a lot bigger for the job that they try to do. Two, they are full of arrogant, ignorant people. It's straight up, all the way down to the bottom. I've seen too many eyes roll at too many partners. It is embarrassingly horrible. You know, so the impact that they think that they can have is not happening. If you're in the State Department and you're good at your job, I'm not talking about you. The problem is if you ask everybody in the State Department who's great at their job, they'd all raise their hand. And there's a problem with that. Same thing goes true for human intelligence collectors. We're all the best at working with interpreters. We're all the best at gathering information. It's not true. So some of the things I want to say, and you didn't smash Susan Rice, and we should smash her too, because for super smart lady, she forgets an awful lot of important stuff. If you are not a source, you should act like it. People who are exploited act like it. They have things that all sources have, and hundreds of millions of dollars. If you don't want to be accused of being someone else's source and being exploited, you probably should have a better answer for why you have hundreds of millions of dollars. And none of those folks do, because they're exploited. As a Californian, I love my home state. You know, I'm in a tent and it's hot in here. I got to take my long sleeve shirt off. It's great here, but I'm not represented in Congress. Neither a senator represents anything that I value. And I don't value bad things. I value, you know, let's work hard, and those that can't help themselves, let's help them, and let's get them working hard. And, you know, that's my basic philosophy. I believe in everybody. If that's not a good philosophy, sorry, that's my philosophy. So now I see someone who's got hundreds of millions of dollars through this stuff, a train to nowhere, all these things that we do. It's not going to, and then the Chinese problem is so crazy, Brad. It's so crazy. I don't know how we fix this. I don't know how we fix the State Department. We collect way too much intelligence on ourselves, and we allow too much of that in the private sector as well. You know, the NSA, and I understand why Ed Snowden did what he did. I'm still conflicted about it, but I also am glad that he mentioned that, because that's not what we're supposed to do to each other. So there's a lot of problems in trying to deal with these things. And I guess all of the things I want to say, I'm going to drone on too long, and no one wants to hear me talk. We want to hear you talk. If you could change one thing, or even two things, like right now, Joe Biden, by miracle, calls you and says, hey, you know what the hell you're doing. Where would you want to put your effort? Like, he's like, you have a task force. I'm going to give you a budget. You get to work on one problem. What's the one problem you think you can tackle in the next 4 years?
Well, I mean, of course, my area of expertise is in intelligence. So if there was one thing that I could do that I was given the power to do by President Biden, I guess it would be I would try to repair the CIA, viewing it as the core of our intelligence community, which is what we're up to 18 agencies, I think, now, because they just added the Space Force into the intelligence community. So I think it's 18 now, which that number just keeps growing. And
how many should there be? Legitimately, like off the top of your head, what would you say? I mean, obviously the DoD needs its family of collectors. I understand. Yes. DOE, very important job. I'm running out of people to say now. FBI, CIA internally, sure, okay, great. CIA, yep, but there are so many more than that. There's so many.
There are, and yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's the world is changing, and we need to adapt accordingly. And certainly the where how intelligence has moved around from place to place has evolved. So those things need to be attacked. In the overall scheme of thing, yes, it needs to be reduced from 18. I think you could probably cut it by 2/3 and have a more efficient system that way, because of all the mission creep and overlap that just constantly grows. I mean, the DNI, for example, was originally envisioned as being this executive office of the Director of National Intelligence and a staff of something like 40 people, was how it was initially passed and envisioned. And very quickly that turned into a few hundred to be able to do this, that, or the other. And then now it's grown to thousands because they've decided to do what? They've decided to copy all the same stuff everybody's already doing, and now they have their own analysts and stuff. I mean, just this is how this works, and government budgeting and all that stuff allows. But back to your original question, I guess if I were allowed to do one thing and given the power to do it, what I would do, and this is something I do in fact recommend and have talked about in the past, would be to take over the CIA, and I would divide it in two. First of all, I would make the CIA, I would try to meld the DNI into the CIA and make the CIA one of the things it was originally intended to be, and that is the clearinghouse for analysis. And I would concentrate as much of the analysis in there as I could, and certainly put the DNI in charge of that. I would have a director of the CIA, but under the DNI, all sitting right there together at the CIA. I would take operations completely out. That door has to be shut between the two of them to make it clean. But if you have a director of the CIA handling all of the analytics, you have a DNI who then is that person who sits on the president's not staff, but the good God. At any rate, when policy decisions are being made, it would be the DNI that would be over there, not the director of the CIA, to create that separation, between the politics and decision making of policy and the structure of the analytical business taking place. Then take the operations end of it, split that all out, and create a separate new CIA organization that's only operations, where it's completely separate. And that way, they have nothing to do with policy. They have nothing to do with the analytical business. All they do is go out and collect the truth. And, if you don't like the truth, that's your problem. You do with it what you will. And that would be a way to do it. In fact, I know where I would put them. The FBI had a headquarters that they were considering putting in out in Loudoun County, right by Dulles Airport. I'd put the new CIA operations office right in there, and the communications and hook up to internet and satellite and all that stuff is perfect out there. And there's even space at Dulles Airport. You could probably sneak in some office space for one reason or another, some nefarious thing or another. And I would like to see that happen, so that we again get the operations doing only operations, not doing the analytical work, so that one does not infect the other, and then create an actual center for intelligence out of the CIA. And then have that be the seat of the DNI power. From there, then it would make more sense for that individual to be able to see what is it the DIA is doing, what are the DOD elements doing, what is the FBI doing, and direct those things, I think, in a more rational manner. So I would probably, that would be if there were one thing I could do, that would be it. So now I'm not expecting Biden's people to be knocking down my door here, but that would be it. Now, last time we had an interview, actually, I'm pretty sure I was promised a dog catcher position if Biden were to become president. So I'm still waiting for that phone call. Haven't heard back on that either.
I'm gonna send Robert Hunter an email about that. That's true.
Yeah. Robert, where'd you go, dude? Where's my dog catcher job?
Yeah. Yeah, and the other thing is that we need to do, and I'm positive you'll agree with this, is we do a terrible job. We have such a great capacity to find all these super smart people and have them become collectors or analysts, and you're 1,000% correct. This job is a sales job anyhow. You don't need the person who's collecting, doing the analysis. Maybe in very extreme cases, or like when I'm forward pushed out and there's no one to to work the stuff for me. Okay, maybe, but we're talking hyper tactical. That's not what you're talking about. But when I left the Army, my captain didn't even follow through with his job of saying, "Hey, let's get you re-upped. What's next?" And we lose a lot of very, very, very capable and developable, if that's a word, agents that just walk away because they've had it. They've been ignored. They've been overworked. It's like, why don't we, from that central clearinghouse of intel, go look at these guys? Let's at least talk to them. And instead of making them come all the way into the system and be told no, because that's the standard answer, let's identify these young agents and figure out where they want to be, if they want to be. Because I would have stayed. I would have gladly come over to the CIA if I could have done it internally. But I put my application in and it was like, I'm no longer interested. The moment passed, and so I walked away. And I had done a lot when I left the military, and I did even more afterwards when I was with the DoD. And and I walked away because no one cared about me ever, and that can't happen.
DoD kind of has an inherent problem, and it's one of the elements of where managing something like that is just by its nature difficult. And that is especially the Army. The Army is big. I mean, they don't call it big green for nothing. It's just big, and you have a lot of generals, which nowadays. Again, this is kind of esoteric. It doesn't matter. But when you get your 1-star. Your first star as a general, basically you've kind of made it at that point. You're a made man, if you want to call it that. And after, I think it's 1 year or two, you automatically get your 2nd star. And from there, you may not necessarily progress past that to get the 3rd, and very few get the 4th. But when you get there, to have accomplished that now in today's military, you're political, because it's a necessity now because of budget and how it works, and budget battles, and how to, it's all these rice bowls. It's how to get more into your rice bowl to make you bigger, to get that 3rd star or 4th star. And, to get that 4th star, you have to change U.S. policy in some way or something like that, where it really floats you to the top and you can get that 4th star. Well, that's all political in nature. And so to succeed, you have to be political. And as I say, it's one of the inherent issues. It's big. There's a lot of generals in the Army, and they're all vying for one thing or another, that shiny thing on the hill they want to put on their own plate and that sort of stuff. So how do you combat that? And I would, no pun intended with that, but it's a hard thing to overcome. And I don't know that there is a solution. In the private sector, you have profit motive that streamlines all of this.
Yeah.
But in government, not only do you not have that private sector motive for keeping everything in line and keeping everything clean and crisp and organized, most of the people that work in government have never worked in private sector. It's been a while since I've seen the figures, but it's something like 85 or 90% of people in government have only ever been in government. So they have no clue what it is to have a profit motive, to meet payroll, to have to pay payroll taxes, to know that if you're off, then the state runs a lot of that payroll tax stuff. Each state, those guys are crazy on this stuff. If you're off by a penny, and by the way, those withholding rates and stuff, the state is entitled to change them with 0 notice multiple times a day. So if you go in and look and say, okay, for my state withholding, I have to take this much out of this check, and they changed the rate this morning, so I know I'm dead on. But at 5 p.m. that afternoon, they change it again, but you're already cutting checks, and they go out, they're dated the next morning, and they go out, and you're off by a penny, you get huge fines for that. Well, that means that any normal person trying to run a small business can't do it. You have to have a service to do it. That starts to get expensive and all that. People who've never come out of that stuff don't understand that you need to have bang for the buck, and you have to have efficiency, work methodology, all that stuff. They don't know, they don't care. And in fact, now I before I went to the CIA, I came out of banking, which, oh my God, to have gone into operations out of banking. I mean, talk about opposite ends. That really is, there's an enormous gulf between those two things. And I remember looking at people, and we were talking about operations, and I'm saying, well, look, we're spending X amount of money on this, and what we're getting out of it is this. That's not much. We're not getting much bang for the buck. Over here, we've got this other program why don't we take half this money, put it over there where we get 1,000 times the results? And I have people get mad at me for that. I mean, in the CIA, that's like, those are fighting words to say, well, that's an inefficient use of our money. This makes way more sense. That's like telling somebody to, F off, in manager speak, because that would, they all look at it as rice bowls and budgets and how do I make myself powerful and how do I get ahead? And
here's a great example of that. When I was I was teaching source operations. And so when we were out of the classroom and doing role playing, which is the thing that we all do when we train, we were allowed to wear civilian clothes. Someone always had their hands on our budget, and someone always wanted to put us in a uniform. And it's like, what on earth do you think we do? We can't go run around town practicing being a spy in uniform. I mean, we will, and then you'll get notified that people are conducting military operations in town. But it doesn't make any goddamn sense, Brad. I mean, this job is so hard to do. It's so incredibly dangerous to be a field collector. I mean, I was realizing the other day, 20 plus years after the fact, we would go out on our team, maybe 4 of us, maybe 5 with an interpreter. And we're all busy thinking our asses off, trying to figure out what question to ask, what language are we, all these things. If someone chose to jump us, and 3 of us had 9mm. There were only 2 M16s on this team, and we would run all over the place. It's incredibly dangerous. And you're going to sweat me. You're not going to send me to other countries so I can understand how to work with any culture. Then why are we doing this? Why are we spending $1 trillion on anything? Spend $100,000 to get someone up to speed with culture, and your agent will instantly be better. These things don't make me crazy. And then I wanted to make a point too about generals. And I'm going to be critical of Secretary Austin for a minute. Secretary Austin's last job when I worked with him, he was the commander of MNFI, which is he was the general of the Iraq operation. And I think at best you can say you give him a C. I ran around town. I was the ground truth guy. I saw all the things that were horrible and screwed up, and we didn't do a good job of pulling out of there. That's on him. He's the boss. And it's not a criticism of him as a person or anything else. But now he has this job as Secretary of Defense, and all I know is that here was the biggest, most important job you had. You were a commander in a foreign combat space, and it didn't work. It didn't work. So he got promoted. I can't get a job over in D.C. He gets promoted. God bless. Good job. Way to go. But come on.
Yeah, that is kind of the way things go. I can give other cases of similar things. I won't, because I'd have to say the names, and some of them are even actually kind of well known. But yeah, certainly the Iraq War was had many issues. A lot of decisions that were made, and some of these were by State Department, some by the military. The CIA, we were pretty small players in the scheme of things. We were not the 500-pound gorilla at the table, so didn't get to make a lot of those calls. But I would argue too, when they got rid of the Saddam Hussein's party, the Ba'ath Party, and made that illegal or disbanded it or whatever they called it, they threw them out on their ears and wouldn't use them. I would say that was a classic mistake. That was one of the things, by the way, that the Army did argue to keep, because they looked back at World War II with the Germans, and they kept all the low-level functionaries of the Nazi Party because they were the ones that ran the waterworks and the electric plants and all of that. And, and they were just like an electrical guy, and you wanted to be in that position, you had to join the party. Same thing with the Baathists. You wanted to run the electrical plant, you had to be in the party. And so they should have kept those low-level guys based on the military model, and that was ignored. That was a State Department call, and so they got rid of all of those guys. True.
I want to say this is real life things. When I was there, we're trying to build confidence in the government, and then the locals would say, that guy right there that you guys picked for governor, problem number 1.
Yep.
He was a cobbler before you guys got here. The guy who we liked, yeah, he was a Baathist, yeah, he was Sunni, but you guys killed that guy. So like problem number 3, 4, and 5 right there. So we pick a guy. At least they think so. And now they're never going to trust that guy. And the guy they like is not bring backable because we killed him. You know, we did a terrible job with that. Terrible job. That did not work. And by the way, dividing Iraq into 3 pieces is not good foreign policy. Just going to say that out loud, just for anybody who doesn't know that.
Well, The whole Iraq thing too is kind of an artificial concept that came after the colonial powers divided up all of that on the heels of World War I and all that stuff. So there's just inherent organizational problems with that whole area of the world, and we're still playing those things out and having wars and shooting and hatred among the different groups out there and all of that. I mean, they should have. I think Trump, he didn't do this very well, but I think his instincts were right, saying that, these guys have hated each other for 1,000 years. Let them kind of divide it among themselves. But if you're going to do that, then you have to you'd have to sort of like let them all form their own new countries based on their own boundaries versus, these artificial boundaries that were put there because, the French wanted to control this sector and the Italians that sector and all of these sorts of things. I would point out, I mean, one of the, it's going to be a problem forever are the Kurds, for example, the largest ethnic group of people that don't have their own country in the world. And, the Turks hate them and all of that. They hate the Turks too, by the way. And, they have sections of Syria and Iraq, and it's a mess. That's all a mess. And that all comes out of that artificial separation into these different countries. That's kind of similar to the thing I was saying about what happened in the formation of Bosnia. It's one of those things that you look at it and go, okay, well, that's going to cause a war down the line. And this is just one more of those sorts of things. And how do you, something that's fracked up, how do you unfrack that? And it's hard, it's hard. I don't know the solution to that. It'll get solved someday. They'll take care of it. But, unfortunately, it's going to be
like the whole conversation about Donald Trump leaving our ally, the Kurds behind. First off, not an ally. Second, our relationship with the Kurds is born on and will always be one of we're going to pull the foot. We're Lucy to their Charlie Brown. We will always pull the football away from them because there's not a president that has the balls to draw a circle on the map and say that's Kurdistan, and I dare anybody to say otherwise. No one's going to do that. And so we are always going to turn our backs on them. We are always going to do that because no one has the desire to take that fight on. And so all this commentary against Donald Trump about that, it's stupid because anybody who knows that there was never going to be a Kurdistan anytime in the next 20 years. Maybe down the road something happens, but not right now. No way.
Probably not, although a lot of people said something similar to having the embassy be in Jerusalem too, and that did finally happen after 6 presidents?
Yes.
Something along those lines. Yeah. So I may be off by 1 or 2, maybe it was 7, maybe it was 5, but that had been going on forever. And by the way, Biden has said his pick for the UN was talking about moving that embassy back to Tel Aviv.
Why?
Which I think they really hate the Israelis. I mean,
the capital of Israel is
it's Jerusalem.
Yeah, it's Jerusalem. It's still going to be Jerusalem. It's always been Jerusalem.
Yeah,
it's also the capital of Palestine. Whatever.
Yeah, fine. Made that there's sections of that city that Bethlehem is right in there, part of Jerusalem, and that's Arab-controlled area. Fine, okay, there. Make that the southern Jerusalem, and that's your part to have the capital out of.
Yeah.
And, which, by the way, I don't know that Bethlehem is south of Jerusalem or not. So don't write me letters, on that. I would like to call this stuff big boy politics. Where we just be big boys, put on our big boy pants, and go in there and face the earth as it really is versus what we want it to be. And fine, Taiwan claims all of China and China claims Taiwan, and just to make them 2 damn countries. I know they'll both hate it, but recognize Taiwan for a separate country. It's been separate for decades and decades. Right. It's its own economy, its own system, and all of that. Make it a separate country, and they'll be safer because China's going to come in and take them back first chance they get. And I would not be surprised to see some very serious, dangerous things go on related to that over these next 4 years or however long Biden's in there, because he's so soft on those issues, and the people who've been brought in are very pro-China. So I really fear for Taiwan in that, and the Philippines and other areas where they're having conflict with the Chinese in the South Pacific, South China Sea, and even Australia, which people don't realize how many problems are going on for them in that area too. They just had a case of it was a gentleman who is of Chinese descent, who was Australian, who went to the authorities because the Chinese pitched him. He was thinking about running for parliament in Australia, and the Chinese pitched him and said, "Run for parliament. We'll fund you. We'll give you $1 million to run your campaign it wasn't disclosed how much they were going to pay him separately, but presumably if they were going to give $1 million for the campaign, they'd pay him another $1 million or something, because the Chinese wanted a reporting source in the Australian Parliament. And that guy ended up dead in kind of unusual circumstances. They claim, it was just some innocent thing he died of. I don't know. It's awfully convenient to the Chinese that guy ended up dead. So I wonder, but that's what the Australian authorities say. So that's a very strained relationship down there too. There's that whole area, and you have to take into consideration India, who's had, I don't know, at least half a dozen fairly serious border conflicts with China, where they've had pitched battles between fairly small groups, but where, say, 10 or 20 people are killed on each side in these things, and they've just gone to Russia. Russia's usually the supplier for Indian military equipment, and they just bought, I think it was a deal for 250, frontline tanks. Right. And tanks are not, are not a ground-based, air defense system that sits there and it's defensive in nature. Tanks are, read Patton's book, the tank is for attack. And so, 250, top line tanks in India, that their thinking has to be something along the lines, if China comes in, we have to, go on a counterattack and be able to mount a major offensive. And 250 tanks is a sizable force. And assuming they'd be able to probably put out 150 or maybe 200 of them at a time, working condition and all that. But that's still, 150 tanks, that's a lot of tanks too. And everything that goes with it. And
to be fair, and you're 100% right. Tanks are for going somewhere. You can leave them as like a very scary wall, but unless there's a whole bunch of fuel trucks lined up behind them, they're not going anywhere, And so that's your image right there coming through, like, oh yeah, the tanks are there. However, now there's 1,000 fuel trucks behind them. Uh-oh. They're getting ready to go. Hey, listen, it's Friday. I don't want to keep you any longer. It's always great to talk to you. I appreciate it. Everybody should go check out Brad's website, Americans for Intelligence Reform. You can see that link on the screen. And of course, if you're listening on the podcast side, you'll be able to go into the show notes and you'll get that. Reach out to Brad. He absolutely is engageable, and you can talk to him and ask him these questions. These are big, huge problems we're talking about. And you have to have people that, I was taught to be above reproach, Brad. That's what I was taught. Be above reproach, so that when someone looks at you, look at me and Peter Strzok, which one of those guys is more above reproach, right? You put me in those jobs, I'm not going to make money off of that. I'm not going to do that because I don't want any sense of impropriety. We've lost control of that. And there are too many Strzoks up there who are looking to enrich themselves. And it's always funny. I'm not a big fan of Donald Trump, but it is funny when people say, especially people on the left, we should have term limits. And I'm like, oh, that's funny because Donald Trump ran on term limits, but we didn't pick him. So it's hilarious. Anything in closing?
Well, no, great speaking with you again. Yeah, I'm actually closing comments with everything going on would probably take me another 20 minutes. So I won't launch into all of that. But thank you for having me again. It's always a pleasure to speak with you. And I am waiting for that offer of that dog catcher job. So don't let me down again on that.
Okay, stand by.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you